Hi, everyone. This is Generation Mad taking over Sustain What by Andrew Revkin yet again. And today our guest is Grant Harrison, the conference chair for GreenBiz Group. And for those of you who don't know what GreenBiz is, it's a company that's working to speed up the transition to a greener economy through media and events. Grant was an American Studies major at Berkeley before getting a master's in environmental governance from Oxford University. And we are so excited to have him here today to pick his brain about the concept of ESG and bringing private markets into the fight for a more sustainable future. And as many of our listeners know, our name, M.A.D, Generation M.A.D, is a double entendre, meaning either mutually assured destruction or making a difference. And we always like to start our episodes off with asking our guest, on that vast spectrum of optimism and pessimism, where do you stand in this looking towards the future?
I like that start, and I'm happy to have my brain picked. There's not a lot of hair in the way, so this should be easy. On the spectrum, I would say it's hard to place from the optimism to pessimism. I think hope maybe is not on the same spectrum, but I have some of that. I think I'm cynical, but I'm very hopeful in people. I'm less hopeful when they get together and build systems, at least the ones that I've participated in and observed. But I'm going to stick with maybe 75% towards the optimistic side, because otherwise, why would I spend my time doing this? I think if I was anything below 60%, then I would be ineffectively cynical, and above 75%, I'd be kind of naively optimistic. So it's a very specific answer. Between 60 and 75%, we'll go with towards optimism.
Yeah, no, I think we're all in agreement there. I think it's really, I know some people in this field who are very pessimistic, and it just gets way too depressing to have mostly pessimism. So I think we all need to keep up that optimistic lens. And the last time that we spoke, like months and months ago, you told me that you were doing a conference in New York. I'm just wondering, what is that? What are you doing at GreenBiz right now? What's going on?
Yeah. One more comment on the pessimism and optimism thing. My opinion is that pessimism is all the inertia is already in your favor. It actually takes work to be optimistic, I think. There's plenty to pluck. And I don't just mean in the era of climate catastrophe, but probably most of the time, being human, it's easier to go towards the other side of the spectrum. So it takes courage to be optimistic, I think. But yes, GreenFin is the name of the conference. End of June 28th and 29th in Chelsea Piers. First time we're doing this in person. It launched in the year of all online things in 2021. Online event is kind of a weird sentence. They don't totally go together entirely, but it was still a quite successful convening. I can't wait to see those humans in person, not in pixels. It's one of 4 main events so GreenBiz Group as an institution, we've got a media channel, greenbiz.com, editorial, webcasts, all the things you can imagine there. Events, a corporate executive network called GBEN, GreenBiz Executive Network, for basically CSOs or whatever a company would call someone who's leading that remit. And GreenFin is the event that tries to bring together the various nodes that make up the whole like green finance and ESG ecosystem. So companies who issue reports about how sustainable they are or aren't, investors who make decisions based on those reports, and then all the kind of acronyms, NGOs that you could expect to support that, SASB and CDP and all the other kind of reporting mechanisms, and other groups that bring together those same kind of community of investors and companies. So I'm quite excited. I was just in New York this last week. I got back last night. I got to see the venue, got to check out the standard High Line, what we will be saying. Not a lot of humans on that High Line, but I hope come June they're back and that we're not still learning the Greek alphabet, because Omicron is enough, I think, for all of us, but we'll see.
Yeah, there's still a couple more letters to go. But when you gave your answer on the range of pessimism and optimism, you also hinted that you had some previous experience with these kinds of, I don't know if they were financial structures specifically or just more generalized organizational groups, but I was wondering if you can kind of give our audience like a overview of that experience that you have and kind of what led you to have the response that you did to that first question.
That's a good question. It might be a spotty hopping through chronologically answer, but I didn't have a particular interest. Yeah, like climate stuff was not on my radar. I'm 30 years old, turned 30 in December. And this was not a focus in my undergrad time. I mean, other than the fact that I'm a human on Earth and I grew up in a place where this is like a relevant conversation in the Bay Area. But aside from that, it was not like a particular passion. That changed as life went on. But one of the more impactful experiences, which I didn't think would have led me to what I'm doing now, but everything makes way more sense in retrospect than when you're doing it looking forward. I guess that's called a resume. But I worked in the Sierra Nevada mountains after college. I didn't really know what to do with myself, and I thought AmeriCorps would be kind of a good pause and also just a really sincerely good use of time. So I lived in Placerville, where the gold was first discovered here in California, and was being sent out by the local resource conservation district, which is a subset of the United States Department of Agriculture that was started after the Dust Bowl to get, engage local farmers with best practices and other things that happened on the land. And my remit was to go to people that logically what I was providing, which was basically just money and guidance and things that would help you as a private landowner to like change your practices, whether it's your kind of have runoff going into the local river or like stuff that a simple amount of money and a simple set of tools could fix. But people were so averse to hearing that or even letting me approach them because I was working for the government. And this area of the world that I was working in is pretty ideologically not happy to see the government plate rolling up on your property, even if they're there to give you money and guidance. It's just the gulf in trust was so huge that that was not particularly inspiring. But it inspired me to look further into this, which is why I ended up at that master's program at Oxford, which was like, how could something so logically in someone's favor make so little sense to them? And how am I completely unable to bridge that gap? What's up with this, essentially? So I got a master's to try and figure out what's up with that. Don't know if it answered that, but it was a good use of time. I also don't want to play too hard into these tropes, but like working in that government setting, it was incredibly hard to get things done with the amount of money and bandwidth we had, of just like what our mission was, and the resources that we could have just seemed so possibly within reach. But when it came down to it, it was like, who has the stapler? I don't know. You had to check the stapler form. Like, we can't afford 3 more staples, so be like careful about that stapler. It was just like, what we're dealing with is so critically important, but it didn't seem to be the priority of the people who are funding those things. I was also there started in 2016 at that role. So that was a pivotal year when working for the government, especially if you're in natural resources. So don't know if that totally answered the pessimism element, but it definitely piqued the curiosity to try and become optimistic, at least.
Yeah, no, I think that definitely answered a lot of the questions, and also brought up something that I've been wanting to ask you, because of your educational background of getting an undergrad degree in something that has nothing really to do with sustainability or environment, which I was very, very tempted to do. Right now, I am in my last semester at Columbia with a sustainable development major, which is kind of the opposite. It's like totally centered around the 17 SDGs and like the UN, and most of my professors are from hard science backgrounds, which isn't really my interest at all. And I'm getting a very like kind of pre-packaged understanding of sustainability that is being decided for me by this institution and it's totally excluding things like the arts and literature. And I'm wondering, like, my mom was an American Studies major, and the reason that she did American Studies, I'm sure my mom is watching this right now, so sorry for outing you, is because she basically didn't want to do math at Wesleyan, and she didn't want to she just wanted to take fun classes. And then she went on to get a social work degree, so she has some specialty. But like, there seems to be a lot of value in that, to me, coming from a place of like, do environmental science, then do a class in economics, then do this. And I'm like, have you found yourself bringing in a lot of what you learned in the American Studies at Berkeley into your decision making?
That is a good question. I guess I can stop saying that because they're all good questions. I'm kind of in the same camp as Mother Assab, who's listening in ostensibly. I mean, yeah, might as well just do the full candid thing because we're humans and we're talking. I didn't finish high school. I didn't plan on like doing anything in this world of sustainability, let alone being educated. I was like, I'm going to hang drywall my whole life and surf and like maybe figure out some purpose elsewhere. Had a friend after I dropped out of high school, moved to another town, who kind of got me interested in like, hey, it's actually maybe worth learning some stuff. Come to this community college. Turned out this is quite satisfying. And then I just kept doing that for a little while. but I definitely started off with the approach of like path of least resistance because I wasn't really focused on a particular outcome. So for me, it's easy to put words on paper and speak much more than putting numbers together and finding the outcome of them. So I kind of started that way. In terms of like specifics, so yeah, fast forward, I do the humanities program. American Studies is quintessentially humanities, and then my master's was social science. So I wasn't a lot of the methodologies of social science were brand new to me when I got in that program. Spent a lot of time learning them. But it's always hard for me to answer the question of like, what do you use from your education? Because I don't know many, like, unless you're learning how to specifically do greenhouse gas emissions accounting or something around manipulating or collecting data in some way very specifically, it's hard for me to find a tangent that ties back to exactly what I've learned. I will say maybe it's a bit of a trope around this, but I definitely learned how to think well in that undergrad program specifically. Definitely if you asked me at age 22 in that Berkeley Humanities, if I was interested in the combination of green and business, I think I would have had a very cynical response that couldn't allow those two to tie together. So the fact that I work at a place called GreenBiz says something about continual learning after school. But definitely learning how to think critically, which I know is also an educational trope. Questioning everything, I think. Being really good about resource vetting and trustworthy sources of information. And honestly, every role, like the role I had before this in GreenBiz was very much a commercial one, working to get funds for GreenBiz to exist through sponsorship and through all the stuff that funds media for the most part. But every role involves connecting with human beings and trying to not curry favor with them, but like, you have to collaborate with everybody along the path, and people tend to want to work with people who they like and get along with and have shared affinities for. So if you don't know how to learn to communicate that and do it in a kind of convincing, persuasive way that also recognizes what that person's seeking on their own end of their own world, since we all live in our own little worlds, that is definitely something I learned through trying to craft meaningful arguments in American Studies. So nothing directly content-wise, but definitely how my brain got shaped and how to approach subject matter for sure was affected.
Would you say that the experience you had in school, especially in Berkeley and like early on through that education, brought out the moral or kind of beliefs that kind of brought you to ESG and like are the foundation for what you're doing now and how you kind of see the world? Or was that more like the working experience you also got, or some like mix of the two?
Yeah, I'm going to keep up with the personal answer because I'm trying to live life that way. That same person who got me back into the community college realm was a friend, a guy who grew up on Kauai, was really into permaculture. Like he started the sustainability council at this community college and we became best friends quite quickly. So honestly, he kind of brought me into this worldview and way of thinking. I'm from like kind of suburban existence that I don't know. I didn't have a spiritual community, didn't have a this or that, just kind of like the little boxes, little houses upbringing. And definitely not centered around all things environment or social justice or any of those words really. So yes, bringing me into the subject matter for sure did start to shape my worldview and my ethics or my morals. I don't know which word I'd take to answer that. But I think what it lacked at the beginning, and I will say, yeah, just to add on to the personal side, that friend unfortunately passed away when we were at Berkeley together. And so I kind of felt I was studying something unrelated, and he had a very developed passion and like ability and all the proper adjectives that are positive to do something really impactful in this space. And I kind of feel like I inherited that from him and kept running with it. And I don't know, it became my own thing at a certain point, but I think that's a relevant thing to mention. But I'm forgetting what the beginning of the question was, actually, when I just diverted.
Oh, no, it's okay. And we're both, I'm sure, sorry to hear about your friend.
It's part of life.
Yeah, well, the question was mostly about like kind of how you developed your mentality around ESG and sustainability.
That's right.
I think that was
yeah.
Yeah.
I think the one thing I do, and I think this might have changed. I don't know where I fit on the spectrum of generation MAD being 30. I'm kind of like a late millennial-ish person, but I know a lot has changed since I graduated in 2014 or graduated undergrad. It's quite a different world in a lot of ways. But my education at the beginning of this sustainability stuff was missing a lot of the human element, which I don't want to frame everything in E, S, and G, but missing that S pillar. It was very focused on just like natural systems on Earth and kind of framing it as though there aren't like really complex cultural histories and complexities around being human and inequalities and all the rest fit into those natural systems. It very much felt just like carbon cycle, other element cycle, and that didn't come until much later on in my education. Might be different other institutions, but that is something that I only picked up a lot later in the game. So, but yes, that is a quite long way of saying yes, it absolutely informed my worldview. And I don't know how popular a statement this is, but I have a hard time ever saying I'm an environmentalist. I don't know what that means, because what is the environment? If the environment encompasses all the things made of concrete, made of flesh, made of other things that are not visible, like if it's all one thing, then am I just an everythingist? I don't know. And I don't like having that pinned into a certain category, because I feel like if you do anything that involves sustaining human well-being and dignity, you're kind of an environmentalist. So I tend to shy away from that saying a little bit, or that category. I don't know if anyone out there in the world agrees with me, but I feel like it paints me into a corner that it makes me inevitably, especially going back to that experience in the mountains and dealing with people, that if I called myself an environmentalist, like that's a very different than saying I'm a steward of the land, or something that like kind of, I don't know, communicates in the language that they would see themselves in. So I don't know what kind of ist I am then. I need to figure that out.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I have a very similar educational background in a sense to you. I wasn't really done with high school, but I had a really bad end of high school experience and ended up taking a gap year and making money to travel, and just went to really small communities in mostly Southeast Asia, and lived really small, like with a bunch of people who had very little access to anything, including education, and started to realize how insanely privileged I had been, and how crazy the education system is in the United States, and like the fact that we have to pay so much for college, and ended up going to community college in Santa Barbara for 2 years, where I met like unbelievably intelligent, smart people, and now I'm found myself at Columbia, which is similar to you. And I also had this, I never thought I would go into kind of a financial ESG space. I was very much kind of against that, very focused on the social aspect of sustainability, like how well-being connects to sustainability in particular. And now the reason I really want to talk to you is because I have kind of stumbled into being in this financial space. I just finished up an internship at a ESG broker dealer, and now I'm starting a new job specifically in like doing ESG consulting. And it's just very like it's weird to be in a big corporate office, and with the kind of sensibility that I have, and being surrounded by people who do want change, but also might just want money, and this is the way to get the money. And before I go to an audience question, I just want to talk about that with you for a second. Like, what's your concept of ESG? How are you grappling with that too? Is this something that I'm just like dealing with because I'm a young liberal arts student?
Yeah, no, I think ESG has become one of the phrases or pithy terms that is being stretched to like a lot of different directions. So it's hard to know what people mean when they say that, kind of like what sustainability has gone through. So when I think of what the host podcast is sustain what, so definitely always good to know what you're sustaining and for whom, the essential addition to that phrase. With ESG, I mean, in the most basic idea of it being a set of metrics and ways of capturing information that investors can use to make decisions, where companies are then ostensibly more sustainable on the earth doing what they do. I don't have a lot of cynicism about the actual process. I know what you're saying about like transitioning from liberal arts student kind of world to, I guess, corporate world is the only way to put it. Wouldn't say I live in the corporate world, because I've worked in this particular bedroom for most of my job at GreenBiz since it's been during COVID. But yeah, there's one of my biggest tensions, and I imagine a lot of people have this, is the phrase itself of like the business case for sustainability. The fact that case needs to be made makes a ton of sense given the logic of capitalism and what we're working inside of. We're not an institution on the outside chipping away. We're on the inside trying to redirect its course, which that could be its own whole conversation. But yeah, part of me feels like it's a success when I'm having conversations with people that didn't come into this space being like, I grew up recycling my plates and went camping with my family and care about, something that brought people, which usually is like or oftentimes in this space through upper middle class paths, through like recreation outdoors and things that got people in tune with nature. So I like it when I'm talking to someone who didn't come in through that path, and it is that person who's like, I'm doing this because there's green and green or whatever, like just thinking about it in terms of gain, financial gain, like that feels like cool. You're in the tent, the tent's getting bigger. I don't know what happens once the tent is so big it's an undefined space, but I mean technically the goal should be to not have people in companies called sustainability blah blah. It should just be that the whole company operates as such, and there doesn't need to be a department. Like it is just the operating model. So but that said, yeah, a lot of my conversations, both professionally and personally, are with people who kind of, would do the eye roll at the whole like, oh, tree hugger thing, which is also part of why I'm like, I don't want to be called an environmentalist for that reason. I want to have as much of an affinity as possible with the widest cast of characters to get people on the same page. Not saying that I have the ability to do that, but anything that's not polarizing is helpful. But yeah, I definitely have some cringy feelings about some of the things one must do when you're just working for profit in capitalism. And I don't know if we'll get to this conversation point, but the fact that Larry Fink's annual letter to CEOs yesterday or 2 days ago, I don't know if that came across your radar, but the fact that it has capitalism in the title feels like a sea change a little bit to me, like 50 years of neoliberalism where capitalism is just the water you swim in and you don't recognize the system and like don't name it, coming off of an era where people list themselves in phone books as I'm a capitalist, it's 1890 and I'm in your town and I want to deploy some capital. Like the fact that the word's brought back up by a dude who's overseeing $10 trillion is cool, regardless of which side of the equation you're on in terms of wanting to sustain capitalism or wanting it to disappear yesterday and have something in its place. So this will be an interesting year of conversation on that front, I think.
Yeah, no, I think for our generation, the reason why I'm seeing a lot now too that people are bringing capitalism like as a term when they're kind of talking about our society and like the systems that exist in our society a lot more, I think has to do with that this generation, for the first time since the Cold War, we're really seeing like people start questioning things. And that's because of like Bernie Sanders and socialism, or because of climate change and people thinking about systems differently. But there was one question that was interesting that we want to bring up before we get more, which is regarding indigenous leaders in tropical forest countries. What might those leaders do to advocate for recognition of their land rights as strategy for mitigating climate risk and for demonstrating adherence to ESG guidelines? So I think that's a really important point, especially when you see so much of the land that's being used for so many global industries is actually coming from like these indigenous peoples. I mean, America kind of has a history of that too. So yeah. I feel like it's definitely an important point to kind of talk about, especially as someone like you has experience in ESG and you've dealt with similar issues already.
Yeah, that is a question that probably I put less thought to in this role than other ones, but I think that's a probably more essential one in a lot of ways. But in terms of the advocating for recognition of land rights as a strategy, I try to think of like, and a lot of my job at GreenBiz is linking with other institutions that have myriad different acronyms, whether they're hosted by the UN or other institutions that are more local, to, I guess, build communities and channels of conversation between folks like being referenced here, indigenous folks in tropical forest countries, as mentioned, and people who have a sway over the outcome of those places, like world banks and all the rest. So not a super revelatory answer, but community building through those channels for sure. In the second, what was the last part of the question? I just disappeared. In terms of ESG, I missed the last bit of nomenclature there.
Oh, yeah.
Demonstrating adherence to ESG guidelines. I wonder if that question is rooted in like participation in carbon offset projects and things like that. Is that what's kind of being referenced in terms of adherence to ESG guidelines, like if it's a reforestation project or things like that? If it is that, that's a question that it's probably outside of my general scope. I don't really deal in the offset realm or the authenticity of those. If anybody even in this conversation here would think offsets are a sensible path, period, there's a good point that they may not be the path, but I don't know if that's a helpful start of an answer to that.
Yeah, I mean, I know you.
There you go.
Well, that's
so yes, yeah. Here, I mean, yeah, that is like, man, I was in just before I was in New York, mentioned that friend who passed away when I was younger. He's from Kauai, so I was back on Kauai. His birthday is January 6th. Unfortunately, that's been co-opted by a different day now. But yeah, having this exact conversation, not that you can really work in private enterprise and go along with the notion that private property inherently can't exist, because unfortunately capitalism is totally built on two premises that I have my own issues with: the private property to be enforced and contracts to be enforced, and the idea that innovation and technology can just keep solving stuff, which I think we've been doing that for a little bit. And oftentimes the need to have your own version of own branded and like innovative version of achieving a thing is oftentimes the problem itself, which also crops up a lot in ESG world. Like ESG meaning specifically finance, not just broadening the term to be sustainability writ large. There's oftentimes seemingly a solution that's like, this is, if there weren't the need for someone to own it and to have the IP for it and kind of make money off of it, obviously, a lot of those things would be solved more quickly, which other institutions that don't have a profit motivation, like SASB, who develops these sustainability standards, or now, I guess, ISSB, which is International Sustainability Standards Board, also not driven by a profit motivation. So there are bodies that help create that path, but it's kind of a circular conversation, because you end up back at the need to have private ownership and profit off of the thing that you came up with. So yeah, it would be really fun actually to have a hopefully staid, but probably not very staid debate with the 21-year-old me, who is just learning those things first, but I do not like the dissonance between, or the false dichotomy, whatever you want to call it, between real world and academic world, which I feel like oftentimes gets presented. But there is an element of like, once you leave the academic conversation or go out into, I guess, the commercial space, they are just kind of totally different worlds. And they're kind of the ships in the night thing passing each other. But I don't know. I'll pause there. Actually, I could go more on the just capitalism itself thread, but I don't know if that's where we want to go.
I think that's a really interesting place to go, especially when talking about ESG and, again, like bringing in basically private markets into sustainability. Like, I think that's basically, just for anyone who's just going to be listening to this and not watching, the comment that spurred this conversation was, land does not belong to anyone.
I think that's a really interesting thing.
Yeah.
Because like, if the idea is like, it's exactly what you're saying. It's a vacuum, right? It's that like, we are people who all own these things equally. There's no material value. There's no resource scarcity. It's like this inherent thing that we live on and this exists, but like we don't actually interact with. But what I think is interesting in this conversation, especially with sustainability and capitalism, which is something I've been thinking about a lot recently, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, is how material scarcity and the need to always consume and produce more things also has an impact on our physical environment. Where, for example, with electric vehicles, there's these issues with lithium, where it's only produced in so many places, which a lot of those places actually have indigenous groups who were not recognized by the government that owns the borders of that land. So they negotiate contracts without even recognizing the group. And then it becomes, of course, some kind of legal action. The legal system is always privy towards capital gain for those countries that they exist in. So they kind of ignore the indigenous people's rights. But at the same time, we're not recognizing the problem that, for example, lithium, which is seen as a good material for environmentalism because it produces green vehicles, it produces batteries and ways to use electricity instead of fossil fuels to generate energy, at the same time has an environmental cost, which is that there's a resource scarcity. So we consume more of the material, we're producing more things. There's a lack of ability to recycle those materials in the supply chain. And now what you're doing is you're creating this thing which shouldn't have value, like land should be a thing that we all exist on freely and equally. You're adding a price tag to it. You're drawing borders, but then you're also not thinking about it through the lens of, like you were talking about earlier, like recycling, like recycle your plate, recycle your food, compost things, like bring things back into the earth. You start thinking about just like consumption. And I think ESG has like the ability to impact that, but I'm not sure if it could in a truly capitalistic system. And I want to know what you think about that.
Yeah, the world of materials is less my focus, but I definitely have opinions or thoughts, which is, yeah, like in some ways, a more succinct way of putting capitalism in lay terms is just like moreism, and moreism doesn't align with like finite boundaries. So that's a pretty tough starting point. The response of, and yeah, just to be totally the moral sense, going back to like no land is owned, it's pretty hard to make a moral or ethical case against that. Like, yeah, how could that possibly fall under the remit of private ownership? It does, of course, because that's the world we're on, but it is pretty like philosophically hard to make the case that someone could own a piece of earth, and yet here we are. But in terms of the system of production and profit and all the rest, response to material scarcity, I have some faith in the circuit, just to move from the ESG phrasing to the circular economy phrasing. And I know there's plenty to talk about on that one itself, but like there still remains the need for profit given the logic of what we're working in. So pick your producer of tech device that we all use, Apple or Dell or whoever, I don't want to name one specifically, but whichever one of those still wants to make money off of the service or the thing they're providing. So this whole product as a service model has some benefit that I think is tangible and has proven good. There's still like the life cycle analyses might not say the same in 10 years or so, but the right to repair movement I know is one that's like, and I'm kind of focusing on consumer technology when I'm saying this, but that's just what comes to mind. But the idea that, you know, you have the divine right to be able to open the back of your device and fix it yourself. You shouldn't be pressured into needing model number 36 because it's incrementally different than model number 34, and one goes to the landfill anyways. So there remains the need for that organization to profit off of the process, but there do seem to be some, or like services, not even just the products themselves, but like TerraCycle, I don't know if you've heard of them, but they make the shelling of a product's container, but then just do the refill process for you, and you keep getting that product, which obviously doesn't eliminate the waste of the product, but at least tackles one element, which is packaging. So I do have some faith in the circular economy model. A lot of it, like a lot of stuff in this space in the last like 3 or 4 years, is not so much speculative, but like a lot of quite good ideas with not a lot of political will or other types of will that are needed to make it happen. But it seems like everybody who I'm referring to is in like private sector world I'm talking about, kind of woke up to the fact that like, oh yeah, the planet is cooking. It turns out that's true. And it turns out everybody, thanks to your generation, honestly, I think that's like a pretty noticeable divide. I don't think we're not that apart in age, but graduating in 2014, like there was no Extinction Rebellion. There was not like, there was less of an, and this is even at Berkeley, which I think is a good proxy for like general liberal institution with educated people who want to see change in a certain way. That was less of an expectation of the private sector. Like you didn't expect when you wanted to go work at Twitter or something, I don't know, whatever you're doing, that you didn't assess the ESG fundamentals of a company and like really ask for the details of like interviewing your interviewer of what are your social metrics, what are your hiring practices, what is your like DE&I goals, and how do they actually like pan out, show me some evidence, not just like you know, thing on your Instagram that says Black Lives Matter for a week and a half, but like substantively what do you actually do? So that's so good on you for doing that. And that's changing the response, honestly, at the top. Like a lot of people who I talk to who are in leadership roles in the world of finance, like maybe 3 years ago would scoff at the push that's coming from the likes of Generation M.A.D and are now kind of, whether they like it or not, are like, oh yeah, the power dynamic is shifting. And also it comes down to basics of like, they need the smart people to come work for them. And that's kind of as simple as that. It's like, yeah. Not to draw it back to a basic business principle, but the talent draw and retention thing is kind of, in an economy that's very skewed towards services, like kind of just the lifeblood of what they can continue doing what they're doing, which will be shaped by pressure from the likes of you trying to work there.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I just was having a discussion with my boss today about like ESG and our generation and your generation, some people in your generation making really big changes because of our expectations and like actually valuing kind of communal well-being a little bit more than as people did before. And it's just so interesting because I'm sitting there and researching these companies that are technically not very environmentally sustainable, such as like oil companies, and trying to figure out ways that they can become more sustainable. And there's this pull within me, like, is my energy as someone who's so like, I want to see this paradigm just crumble and a complete paradigm shift. I'm ready for it. very much kind of against the current capitalistic system, and I'm sitting and being part of it in this ESG world by making really small changes in companies. As you said, like right now there's this little tab at the top of a bunch of websites now that say ESG or sustainability.
Mm-hmm.
You can click there and it says, oh, we're really diverse, or we're making changes and investing in electricity and planting trees, which I think we all know doesn't really make any difference. But just the last part doesn't make a difference, the tree part.
Yeah.
But also, like, it's kind of amazing that an oil compression company is seeking out ways to become more sustainable, and they have to say, we are only here for the transition to clean energy, or they're going to be completely like ghosted by investors. It's so fascinating, and it's such a weird place to be in, I think, like contributing to that little tab. Yeah, I don't know. That was just a total tangent. But.
No, I mean, what's so interesting about ESG when you're talking about our generation too is I think it's not just our generation, it's like the systems that are being built right now as well. And I think what's better about ESG compared to previous ways of thinking about, for example, pollution, right? Like how do you tax pollution? How do you use the metrics that define pollution? Is ESG is environmental, social governance. It's not just the environment, there's other things as well. So like how you treat your workers is part of ESG. How you impact society and all these other metrics that are kind of outside just what you throw into the air or what you dump in the water, which are also important things. But like once we get over climate, or if climate gets over us, whatever happens first, you know, there's still these other metrics we need to look at once we move on to the next problem. And I think that's why it's really great and why it's like such a great way of broaching these topics, because I think we can all agree like there's more that needs to be done, for example, for an oil company than just like investing in clean, like, I don't know, like solar or wind, right? Like we need to like massively restructure the way that society like produces energy and like organizes itself. But good start at the same time, right? So you need to take what you can.
I think like one of the things I've learned in this role is it's really hard to just say like that's a good company, that's a bad company. It seems easier the closer I get to the inner workings of it, the more I'm like, okay, it's actually a little more nuanced, which I hear come out of my mouth and kind of grimace at, because nuanced oftentimes sounds like I've compromised, and I'm going to use nuance as a more defensive way of saying that. But truthfully, like you bring up the different sectors that make up this economy. Like, of course, a large tech company whose primary impact on the physical earth is data center usage, and you can pretty quickly procure clean energy power purchase agreements and like literally run on clean energy 24/7, which is a laudable thing. That's a lot easier of a leap than like rejiggering an entire economy based on burning fossil fuels and you being at the foundation of that, the person who digs them up and burns them. So the approach for each is quite different. That's not to say, to oversimplify, that first group identified clean energy is good, but also like, you know, there's a role for fill in the blank company with this or that. I don't feel comfortable naming specific ones, but you know, like social phenomena happening outside the boundaries of this company are totally dependent on some of the tools that are made by said companies. It's good that energy is clean, but like, you know, there's the S pillar, like you're talking about the different acronyms. So good company is a harder thing for me to frame, but like you're talking about clicking on their website and looking through, something that I'm hearing from people who work in these large institutions and really want people like you to come work there. There's more scrutiny being applied to like click through the sustainability tab. And yeah, like you're not going to be swayed by pictures of people just riding their bike through a nondescript place, throwing a flower or whatever. Just like, what does that even mean? What does that have to do with what you do? But they're getting, they have to become more rigorous about this. Not to say that every 22-year-old is going to go read every like 10K financial filing of company they want to work at, but given what's happening on the regulatory horizon, both in the United States, in the EU, and also in certain Asian economies, like the mandated requirement to report against your, I don't know how much this is relevant to this particular audience, but like different reporting frameworks like TCFD, the Task Force on Climate Financial Disclosure, like that becoming mandated, already mandated by the UK and New Zealand and other economies, but the fact that it's going to be pretty guaranteed, I don't know in what form, but in the next couple of years be the type of report that cannot be riding your bike through the flowers in a nondescript place and kind of just a narrative description of why you're a good citizen. There will be a mandated set of metrics against which you have to report, and standards, which the International Sustainability Standards Board is going to be working on, that allow not just investors, but people like you and prospective talent and also civil society and whoever else to get a more transparent lens into what does XYZ company do good or bad. And there will be less room for greenwash, green wish, green other things that are not just green fact. So I do have, that's one of the places, going back to the optimism and pessimism spectrum, one of the things that keeps me close to the optimism side, oops, it's reflected the other way, I'm on screen, so actually that way, is the mandated transparency. I think the absolute best in people, like I said before, when I meet them individually, I love every single person whose eyeballs I look at. I'm like, you're such a, at your core, just magical little creature. Get all of us together in systems and things get different. Crowds of people are different entities. I don't trust them as much to be transparent, especially when the motive is maybe not rooted in something ethical, like telling the absolute truth. But when, you know, whatever, I guess I'm going to say trust but verify, not to, I think that's a Reagan quote. I don't oftentimes quote Reagan, but I feel strongly that the verify part is coming in full force. So I think as a result, trust will be inevitable to some degree.
Yeah.
So
that's like one of the things that I think is really interesting about what GreenBiz is doing, like just their tagline of like making, what was it again? Like stepping towards a more green future through events and media, like using events and like sitting next to someone and looking them in the eye. And that, like, every single time I go up, I think I've said this like a million times, but it just is so stuck in my head. Like every single time I go up in an airplane and I look down and I see like the human world underneath that we've built and all the buildings and concrete and little people, it's like, I feel so removed from who everyone is and what everyone's thinking. But even if I'm sit across from someone with a vastly different opinion than me at a table, at a conference, at something, there's like some connection there. And I feel like that's one thing that we're totally losing. And I'm just curious, like you work in events, is that, what do you see there?
Yeah, what's the word? Serendipity is one of them that comes to mind, but yeah, the chemical reaction when humans, which is something that I'm having, like I was a full on just like, let's work from home forever person when this started, because I love my slippers. I love that I can surf every evening. Like life is very good in that sense, but I've noticed a lack of like, not even just cohesion with colleagues, but like the sparks that literally fly chemically when you're just bumping into people who are thinking about similar things, and revelatory things that wouldn't have come up when you have to schedule every call for a half hour, Slack people. It's just like not a very inspiring way to connect. So the same thing with events. I've witnessed some of these in person, like the beginning of a conversation or a relationship that's like, that's going to substantively lead to like a different action on the part of that one person. Yes, that's only one person, but they're going to take that back to this institution that they have a lot of sway over, and a whole business practice is going to change. I say business practice specifically because we're GreenBiz and it's a business to business conference. So in our setting, it's like getting one of those inert institutions that maybe doesn't have a lot of internal champions for doing green and sustainable things to empower that person to go back and make the case, whether it's business or otherwise case, to other people who have more decision-making power. And I haven't been here that long, but I've already watched in like the 3-year path, that kind of, the most immediate one that's obvious is like, you know, renewable energy. People are there to offer something that's quite compelling to institutions that need energy and are driven, yes, by cost savings, but also by myriad other factors. And that case is made to them at events like GreenBiz or Circularity or Greenfin, whatever it happens to be. So it's part community building, part market building, I guess, if that can be described like that. It's harder to do online for sure. Like online events where I think they'll probably be part of the fabric of, I mean, this is an example of that, I guess. It's not really an event, but they have purpose. But the value, yeah, I don't know how to innovate your way out of just like bringing human bodies together in a place to converse and do things that humans do for an outcome. It's also satisfying because we're not, I mean, again, we're a business to business conference, but there are other voices like Greenpeace and Rainforest Action Network and, you know, other nonprofits who don't have a commercial stake in what we're talking about, who come and speak and engage. And it's pretty satisfying to watch minds change in real time, of like watching someone have to defend what they thought was their foundation. And then as they're in the conversation, kind of realizing like, oh, the fact that I can't talk my way out of that one kind of means that like maybe I've arrived. Everyone shows up amenable to change. Otherwise, it would just be a massive argument. If you're not amenable to change something, why would you enter a conversation? So it's sometimes few and far between, but it is every little node that changes in that matrix. Like it's a pretty influential matrix of people. So I see it ripple out into the real world after we leave the conference. But yeah, like a lot of things, it's hard to maintain that. Like you feel the zeal and all the good, and then Monday rolls back around and you're like, crap, like back to whatever this minutia is. So keeping that alive is hard, but it's very palpable when you're there.
Yeah. And would you say for like young people who are just leaving college and want to kind of enter the ESG space, that there actually are like a lot of places to have those kinds of discussions and people really are open-minded to solutions and like they can have their voice be heard? Or is it more of like the same system rebranded?
That's a good question. I guess it would matter whether you're someone interested in trying to join their world and they view you as prospective talent, or if you're just simply identified as like risk element, because those are going to be treated very differently. So honestly, the concept of an open forum where you can come and ask questions like that and kind of show them that you might be a prospective interviewee in the future, there unfortunately aren't a lot of settings like that. And I can say that the case with my event, for example, GreenFin, it's just simply not geared towards that. It's a by invitation only for people who have a certain amount of sway already in the industry and who are building out teams, ironically looking to hire people like you in the near future. The funny thing about ESG specifically, again, just in green finance and like investment institutions, is there's not a lot of people that already have a like certified skill set. That's definitely going to change in like the next 2 or 3 years. The CFA Institute and Principles for Responsible Investment and other people who can give you credentials to do said practice are starting to build those out quickly. But for now, there's an obvious need to have a dedicated remit of people focused on ESG, but there's not as obvious of a skill set to make up that group. So a lot of the people who I talk to as part of my job of like, what are you doing in that new role called ESG something? The response is oftentimes check with me in like a month or so, because I'll let you know, because they're kind of plucking for lots of skill sets, diversifying and then seeing what makes sense. Tangent of an answer to your question, but no, there's a bit of a lack of that space. But I think that, again, I keep drawing it all back to talent draw and retention for a reason, I guess, but to build trust with the people that they'd want to come and spend your time and life dedicated to making change with them probably requires having more open forum and more open conversation. So I would hope to see that in the next couple of years, and hopefully through our media channel, we can do that or encourage others to make for more candid conversations, because the one-sided, leave an Instagram post and not respond to it from company X, Y, or Z is totally ineffective. And I think enough of them are starting to realize that will be its own competitive advantage, being an actual, like an embodiment of the thing that you're, like you were saying, Sophia, click through the sustainability tab. We are this type of citizen. We are this person in the world. Those who can follow up and be authentic and transparent and other keywords like that will reap a lot of benefits, even if in the short term, maybe it's somewhat costly, even if at all. I think that will start to crop up more and more. I don't see the trend going the other direction, just like with climate change. It's not like these things the curve is going up and there's no sign of that changing. So I think companies get on board inevitably.
But are there any companies or like any organizations where you're kind of starting to see that progress? Like, just to call out a couple.
If you're allowed to.
Yeah, if you're allowed to.
I probably shouldn't name specific commercial institutions that I think are quite laudable. I think there's things in other like regards that I could elevate certain companies that are doing things that other companies aren't doing. Like there are, like State Street, for example, second largest, maybe third largest money manager in the world, first institution of that size, managing whatever, somewhere between $5 and $7 trillion of other people's money, some of which is ours or our retirements, have required that every company has to do a TCFD report to be a portfolio company, period, which that's like not mandated yet. I mean, part of it is just strategic, because regulatory horizon wise, that probably will happen at some point anyways. But those are more like kind of technical changes that are happening, I think, within the industry. Enough technical changes leads to substantive change, but not entirely. I think in terms of the opening, like really transparent communication channels with the people like yourselves, civil society, is lacking. And I don't have a finance background. Like talking around the dinner table at my family, there was nothing about 401ks and, like what is compound interest and all that. That was not part of my world. And so I'm newer to the finance space myself, but it's a risk averse industry. It's based around risk and reward. For every unit of risk, you go for 1 unit of reward, and it's just a little bit more risk averse than others. And so opening conversations to people that are not in exactly your camp comes with a risk, but only for so long. So
yeah, and just like kind of a final big question, which I think we've definitely touched on throughout, but just like I know why I'm going towards like the more financial aspect of sustainability, because like clearly money, like everyone in ESG has kind of said to me like money is where the change is, and I'm just wondering, like, is that why did you end up here? Why did you choose to go down the financial route?
Yeah, if the problem that is ahead of us is an existential one, which it is, and if it has very small time horizons to do stuff, which it does, then obviously you want to go for the highest impact possible and most quickly. And a system that's built entirely on using the capital markets as resources, why would you not start at the base, I guess? Like, someone has to be everywhere in that whole matrix, but it makes a lot of sense to go right into the belly of the whole situation and allocate capital to the right things and kind of starve it from the wrong things, rather than working from the other way back, which is not to discredit that direction, but it just felt very clear, like someone else said capital markets are the oxygen of the economy. And so if that's truly where the oxygen is being produced, why not get in there and rearrange whatever technical things make up lungs? I don't know that analogy, can't go any farther with that one. But yeah, potentially not popular statement from some people, but like a lot of industries are overcomplicated that don't need to be. There is definitely a financial complexity complex that is like, it helps when things are complex because then you can come there to solve problems. So a lot of it actually isn't as complex. If you're outside the world of finance, it looks like kind of a behemoth of numbers and quantitative things and like complex factors that are just not that complex. So once I started to figure that out based on just reading other publications like Responsible Investor and ESG Investor and all these different publications that make this kind of translated to the layperson, I realized I, as that person who, like Miss Assab, didn't want to encounter math and intimidating things, can totally jump into that realm and kind of have an influence in a way that isn't just, tweaking this or that part of the equation, but trying to fundamentally change an industry, which is a huge task. And I'm just like one part supporting it, but
yeah, no, totally. I mean, I'm also like my mom, I really hate math and never wanted to go into finance. But I've also worked through basically since I was a sophomore in high school, I've been doing nonprofit work and thought I was going to go into human rights and then this, and totally thought I was going to continue down the nonprofit track. And as you mentioned earlier in the talk, like there's just so much bureaucracy and slowness. And obviously that's not the fault of the nonprofits. It's the fault of the way our system is set up, where there's not enough funding there and things move really slowly. And government too. Like I took a class at Columbia called Sustainable Management, and basically the bottom line of the class was, if you want things to move fast, go into the corporate world. If you want things to move slow, go into government or nonprofit. But someone just asked, do we think that ESG is an elitist project, and how can we make it a populist project? Which might be a nice question to just finally round off on. Yeah.
I mean, we can put, not to just deprecate ourselves, but here I am in San Francisco talking to you over there, Columbia students, about ESG. Like, kind of the word elitist isn't far off from a lot of these conversations in the first place. Not calling us all elitist, but you know what I mean. So in some ways, yes, it is, and I still feel the need to differentiate ESG as just a capture of like sustainable business practice versus this actual kind of like technical application of stuff to the industry of finance. So in that second sense, it is elitist in the sense that you have to have spent a number of your hours of your life learning about technicalities around how capital markets and corporate issuers function. Outside of that part of just like the more populist side of the project, I guess, using this language from the question, it doesn't have to be, but it has been so far. But that is an offshoot of the fact that the entire environmentalist movement has been which has changed a lot as it's included Indigenous voices and people that are not from the upper middle class, went camping and like the environment path. But the ESG, everything, corporate sustainability, ESG, all the rest kind of does stem from that same origin, and that's constantly needing to be changed. So unfortunately, yes, a little bit, but it doesn't mean that it has to stay that way by any means. It could definitely become, there are certain tenets of it that it would be hard to mesh them with any kind of populist narrative about anything, but a good chunk of it could become a populist project, and maybe some parts would have to be shed. So if I'm understanding what a populist project is in its entirety.
I think the scary and exciting thing about ESG is that it's so new in a sense, and like it isn't really defined yet. Like obviously we have environmental social governance, but we have this opportunity to kind of make it what it's going to be right now. And like the people who are in it just have, like, I believe everyone I've met in it in a sense is like coming at it from a really good place, and it's not necessarily like I'm just here to make money through pretending to be sustainable. It's like I actually care about sustainability, therefore let me kind of worm my way into the system, do as much good as I can, and then whatever happens. But yeah, I think it's just really important to always keep in mind, as you said, like it doesn't have to be the way that it currently is, and
Totally.
Yeah, just making sure to kind of ESG itself, like make sure
that meta ESG. I like that.
Total ESG. It definitely needs to happen more than it is happening. Definitely.
Oversight, just in general.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Agreed.
And that's where transparency comes in, right? Like the ability to have a nonprofit organization or a third party that's kind of always overseeing behaviors, especially for specific metrics, which could be also another interesting like future paradigm for ESG, where there's just certain metrics that are always publicly transparent, right? And then that kind of brings the populism of it. So you can always see what someone's polluting or what they're doing without even needing disclosures or without needing to see the information.
Yeah.
It doesn't sound far-fetched. That does not sound like a far-fetched possibility I would place that in like, depending on how all these, the 2050 net zero targets with 2030 interim targets, depending on how those interim targets go, if they're set at all, I could see the 2030s seeing something like that. But I am just a guy with an opinion in San Francisco at the moment. But
and this is also the time of like early adopters in ESG and environmentalism. Like we kind of want it to become this thing where a finance person chooses to take this route instead of going to like a bank, right? A traditional organization, because that's how you know you're successful. That's the metric.
Well, even people going for the traditional roles in banks and financial institutions are starting to put, and our events serve as this sometimes. Like we'll have hundreds of people from a company come to an event because they're there and they have roles that have nothing to do with sustainability in their title or ESG in the remit, but they work in HR or real estate services or whatever it is, and they want to know how they can embed that into their role. So if companies aren't providing ways for your average person who's not in a role that is dedicatedly called sustainability, can't figure out a way to make that person feel substantively like they're attached to that, that's going to be hard for them to draw someone, because someone else is working on that right now to figure out how to embed that in every role throughout the firm. So I'm feeling more optimistic at the end of this conversation. Thank you for that. I'm like 80% right now.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to come on. I think like the reason that we're doing this, and we have continued from the first one, is because it's so cathartic to sit down and talk with someone kind of face to face. I can see your face. Thank you again.
Yeah, no, this has been so great. And just like being able to have like a conversation that's just casual, where everyone kind of is like somewhat on the same page, but also like has a unique background. It's like really informative.
Well, I appreciate the invite, and it was an hour very well spent. I would love to do a chapter 2 another time, see what's developed in the world since this conversation. But I'll definitely be having Generation M.A.D on my podcast queue now that I've tuned in a little bit. To anybody listening, check out past couple episodes that y'all have had. It's something worth putting on your radar. So thank you for having me along.
We'll share that around on our social media pages too.
Thanks for the shout out.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. Well,
all right.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good, thank you, Grant.
Good Friday afternoon, eve, morning. See you all on the internet again soon enough.
And Happy New Year.
All right. Yeah, you too. All right.